Hey everyone, welcome back to Evil Shadow. Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and dive into the darkness. Imagine hearing strange noises at night, feeling like you're being watched, but when you look, no one's there. Tonight's story will chill you to the bone and leave you questioning what's hiding in the shadows. Don't say I didn't warn you. When I first moved into my new house, I couldn't have been more excited. It was the kind of home I had always dreamed of. Quiet, spacious, full of potential. It was perfect until it started to unravel. The house sat on the edge of town, tucked away behind a row of overgrown trees and hedges. The kind of place where you'd never expect anything strange to happen. But the longer I lived there, the more I began to feel that something was wrong. It was an old house, and that should have been my first warning sign. The floorboards creaked with every step. The walls seemed to whisper in the wind, and no matter how much I cleaned, there was always a layer of dust that returned by morning. But the one thing that really started to unsettle me was a small, unassuming door in the basement. I don't even remember noticing it at first. It was hidden behind old furniture and shelves, just tucked away in a corner like an afterthought. But one day, when I was cleaning out the basement, I stumbled upon it. It was an odd little door, barely big enough to be considered a closet, but there was something about it that felt wrong. I tried to open it, but the door was locked. At first, I thought it was just an old storage room, probably full of forgotten junk like many of the other rooms in the house. But that door felt different. It had an eerie presence. The rest of the house was a mess, but it was a comforting kind of mess. This door, however, seemed to hum with a cold, oppressive energy. It drew my attention every time I went down there. The previous owners had told me it was just a utility room. They said they'd misplaced the key, but that it wasn't anything to worry about. That didn't sit well with me. There was something in their tone when they said it, something that felt guarded. But I brushed it off. After all, they had been perfectly nice during the house tour, and surely they were just trying to avoid a minor inconvenience. But my curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't leave it alone. Weeks passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about that locked door. It lingered in the back of my mind. I would hear strange sounds at night, scraping, tapping, coming from the basement, and I couldn't help but imagine what was behind that door. It wasn't long before I hired a locksmith. I told him to come over and open it for me. The locksmith was an older man, gruff but efficient. He didn't ask many questions, just worked in silence, his tools scraping and clicking against the lock. My heart raced as he worked, each click of the lock sending a jolt of excitement and fear through my chest. When the door finally creaked open, I wish I had never seen what was inside. The room was like a shrine. It wasn't just a storage room or utility closet. It was set up with a purpose, and I could feel that purpose lingering in the air. Old photographs covered the walls, each one faded and yellowed with age. The faces in the photos were distorted, as though someone had intentionally scratched at them, obscuring the features. But there were symbols, too, strange, intricate markings that seemed to pulse in the dim light. In the center of the room was a single chair. It was old, with cracked leather and a stained cushion. It sat facing the wall, the back of the chair as if someone had been forced to sit there for hours, maybe longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for something, or someone, who had never left. I hesitated at the doorway, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It felt like I was intruding on something sacred, something dark. But my eyes kept returning to the chair, to the way it was positioned so deliberately in the middle of the room. That's when I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. There was another door, hidden behind a pile of old debris in the corner. It was small and barely noticeable, but it was there and it wasn't locked. I reached out with trembling hands and opened it. Behind that door, A narrow staircase descended into darkness. I couldn't breathe for a moment, my mind racing. There was a sickening realization settling in my stomach. The staircase led further down, deeper into the earth, into a part of the house that I hadn't even known existed. I took a step back, my heart thundering in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself from walking down that staircase. The air grew colder as I descended, the faint smell of mildew, and something much worse, something rotten, hanging in the air. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step a loud protest against my movement. It felt like the house itself was resisting me, warning me to stop. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another door. This one was solid, old, and covered in grime. The door handle was cold to the touch, and when I turned it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. As the door creaked open, I was hit by the unmistakable scent of dampness and decay. And then I saw it. Beyond the door was a cellar, but it wasn't like any cellar I had ever seen. It was vast, stretching out into the shadows, with walls lined in cobwebs and old wooden beams that seemed to groan under the weight of something else. It didn't look like a place where food or supplies were kept. No, this was a place meant to hide something. Something or someone. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step inside. My feet shuffled across the cold, wet floor, my mind racing with questions. What had happened here? Who had built this hidden room, this secret cellar? Then I realized the truth. Someone had been living in my house. For who knows how long, someone had been hiding here, hidden away in the depths of my home. The silence at night, the strange occurrences I had dismissed as imagination, they were all connected. The missing items, the eerie whispers in the walls, the cold spots that would appear in the middle of summer. They all pointed to this. I rushed back upstairs, my mind spinning. I couldn't get out of the basement fast enough. I locked the cellar door behind me, my hand shaking. But even as I bolted the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, as I lay in bed, the sounds began. At first it was faint, a tapping, soft like fingers against glass. But then it grew louder, more insistent, as if someone or something was outside trying to get back inside. The tapping came from the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. No one. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a tree branch brushing against the window. But then I heard it again, and again, louder, more frantic, like a warning. I barricaded myself inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing that had been hiding in my house was still out there, still trying to find its way back inside. I could hear it, faintly, tapping on the glass, whispering through the walls. I called the police, but they found nothing. No traces of anyone in the house, no signs of forced entry. They said it was probably just animals, but I knew the truth. The worst part is, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that cellar never really left. It's still out there. Maybe it's waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for the next time I forget to lock the door. The house is quiet now, but I can still hear the tapping sometimes in the dead of night. And when I close my eyes, I see that chair again, the one facing the wall. And I wonder who sat there, and for how long. Maybe I'll never know. Maybe that's the scariest part of all. When I first moved into my new home, I was excited. I had always dreamed of living somewhere quiet, peaceful, far from the noise of the city. Living alone was a big change for me, but it was one that I found surprisingly comforting. There was a sense of freedom, a space all to myself where I could think, unwind, and enjoy the solitude. But the peace I sought came at a price. Something or someone in the house next door would slowly chip away at my sense of security. At first, there was nothing unusual. My neighbor's house was old, run down, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that had long since claimed any sense of order. It looked as though no one had bothered with it in years. The house was dark, and the windows always seemed to be shut tight, as if no one had lived there in ages. The lawn was unkempt, and the porch light never flickered on at night. I assumed my neighbor was just an elderly man, maybe a recluse, or someone who simply didn't care for visitors. He never came outside, never waved or acknowledged anyone in the neighborhood. I figured he was just one of those people who preferred being alone. But something felt off. Over time, I started to feel a sense of unease, an unsettling feeling that crept in when I was at home. It was as though I was being watched. It began subtly, a flicker of movement through his dark windows late at night when I would step out onto my tiny balcony to smoke. At first, I thought it was nothing, but as the days went on, I started noticing a figure standing perfectly still, staring at me through the window. I couldn't see his face clearly, only the dark silhouette of a man, motionless, staring at me. His eyes seemed wide, almost unnaturally so, and I could feel them on me, even through the thick glass. It sent a chill up my spine. Sometimes, I would catch him staring for what felt like hours, just standing there in the shadows. The longer I lived there, the more I became convinced that he was waiting for something. But for what? One night, after days of feeling his eyes on me, I decided I couldn't take it any longer. I had to know what was going on next door. The silence, the stillness, it was too much to ignore. I walked over to his house, my footsteps heavy against the cold ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the front door. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I felt the need to confront him. I knocked on the door. At first, nothing, but then I heard something, movement from inside the house. The door creaked open just a crack, and there, standing in the doorway, was a woman. She was old, her skin tight and wrinkled, her face completely expressionless. Her eyes were the color of faded stone, lifeless and empty. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't even greet me. She just stared at me, as though she was trying to understand who I was or why I was standing there. The silence stretched on for far too long, and I felt the air in the space between us grow heavier, suffocating. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared with a cold, empty gaze that made my skin crawl. It was as though she was measuring me, deciding something. I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away, feeling the weight of her gaze still on me as I retreated. I walked back to my house, my heart still racing. What had just happened? Who was she, and why was she so detached? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with her. Something beyond the physical age that had worn away her features. That night, as I stepped out onto my balcony, trying to shake off the eerie encounter, I saw her again. She was standing in her yard, just outside her house, staring directly at me. She wasn't moving, just standing still, her eyes unblinking. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My body froze as I stood there, unable to tear my eyes away from her, as she remained perfectly still, her eyes boring into me. The next day, something even stranger happened. I was walking through my yard, trying to push the unsettling encounter from my mind, when I noticed something odd on the ground. A sock, just lying there, right by the fence. It didn't belong to me. I didn't know whose it was, but the sight of it sent a chill through me. How had it gotten there? It was almost as if someone had been standing right at the edge of my yard, watching me. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to a random occurrence. But when night fell, I felt that familiar unease creeping back in. I was sitting on my couch, trying to relax, when the doorbell rang. It was a sound I hadn't expected at that hour. I checked the time, almost midnight. My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly got up to answer the door. As soon as I opened it, I saw her, the woman from next door. She was standing there, expressionless as always, but this time, her face was twisted into something darker, something far more sinister. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, her lips curling into a grin that sent waves of dread through me. In her hand, she held a kitchen knife. It gleamed in the dim light of the porch. Before I could react, she lunged at me, screaming incoherently. "You took him. You took my son from me." Her voice was shrill, filled with madness. I barely managed to slam the door shut before she could reach me. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I backed away, my thoughts spinning as I realized just how dangerous she was. I called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what had just happened. When they arrived, they found her standing in front of my door, still clutching the knife. They took her away, but not before I caught a glimpse of her twisted expression, her eyes wide and unblinking as she was led to the squad car. The police said she had been living alone for years, and that she had been suffering from severe mental illness. They took her to a psychiatric facility, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her actions than simple madness. The way she had been watching me, the way she had been lurking in the shadows of her house. It felt deliberate, almost as if she had been waiting for me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I moved out a few months later, unable to shake the fear that clung to me like a second skin. The thought of living next to her, knowing she was still out there in that house, haunted me. But even after I left, I couldn't forget her. I couldn't forget the way she stared at me, the way her presence lingered, even after she was gone. I still wonder if she ever left her house, if she's still out there watching. I wonder if she's still waiting for me, just like she had waited for so long before. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel it again, the sensation of being watched. And I can't help but wonder if the silent neighbor is still out there, still staring. When we first moved into our new home, I had the typical excitement of a fresh start. It was a charming house, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It had the kind of character you could only find in older homes. Creaky floorboards, intricate woodwork, and a large, dark basement. At first, everything seemed perfect, but then something caught my eye. A door in the basement, a door that didn't belong. It was odd. A simple, unremarkable door tucked behind an old, dusty shelf in the corner of the basement. The kind of door you would barely notice if you weren't looking. But something about it felt off. There was a strange energy in the air whenever I passed by it. The door was locked, and the key was nowhere to be found. I asked the previous owners about it, and they gave me a vague response, brushing it off with a smile. "Oh, that's just the storm room," they said nonchalantly. "It's where we keep safe during tornadoes. The lock's broken, though. We lost the key years ago." Their explanation didn't sit right with me. The way they said it, so easily, so dismissively, left a nagging feeling in my gut. There was something they weren't telling me. I couldn't shake the thought that there was more to the storm room than they were letting on. For weeks, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just an old, forgotten part of the house. But every time I walked past that door, I felt it, something drawing me in, urging me to open it. Curiosity became a hunger I couldn't control. I had to know what was behind that door. Finally, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I hired a locksmith, hoping to get some answers. When he arrived, I showed him the door. He examined it for a moment, then went to work on the lock. It took a while, longer than I had expected, but eventually, the click of the lock echoed through the basement. The door creaked open slowly, and as it did, a cold, musty air rushed out from the darkness beyond. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped into the room. The room was nothing like I had expected. It wasn't a safe room, as the previous owners had claimed. It was far darker, more unsettling. The walls were covered in black and white photographs, but these weren't the kinds of photographs you'd expect to find in a family home. No, these photos were disturbing, strange, filled with symbols I couldn't understand. Some looked like they had been hastily scribbled onto the pictures. Others were so old and faded that they were barely recognizable. Faces, blurred and ghostly, stared back at me from the photographs. At the center of the room was a single chair. It was worn, the fabric torn and frayed from constant use. The back of the chair faced the wall, as though someone had been forced to sit there, staring into the dark, waiting. As I took in the room, a shiver ran down my spine. I felt a creeping sense of dread settle in my stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. This wasn't a storm room. This was something else entirely. The air felt thick, as if it had been saturated with fear for years. I moved slowly through the room, my eyes darting from the photographs to the corners, trying to make sense of it all. In one corner of the room was a cot, a cheap, old cot with dirty, crumpled blankets. There were food wrappers scattered on the floor, empty chip bags, water bottles, and scraps of paper. Trash was strewn about the room, as if someone had been living here for a long time. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been living here. Someone had been hiding in this room, in my house, for God knows how long. The thought made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Who had been living here, and why? As I continued to explore, I found something else, something that made my blood run cold. In the back of the room, hidden behind piles of old junk, was another door. It was small, almost hidden, but it was there. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. I turned it slowly, my breath shallow in my chest. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase. It descended into the darkness, and as I looked down, I could see the faint outline of another door at the bottom. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to get out of there, but I couldn't. I had to know what was down there. I carefully made my way down the stairs. With each step, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. The silence was deafening. When I reached the bottom, I opened the door. The sight that greeted me made my heart stop. Beyond the door was a small cellar, and at the far end of the cellar, there was another door. But this one didn't lead to another room inside the house. No, this door led outside. Someone had been secretly living in my house. They had been hiding in that room, using it as a place of refuge, and they had been coming and going through that cellar door. It was like something out of a nightmare, and I felt sick to my stomach as I pieced it together. Someone had been watching me, living right under my nose. I didn't waste another second. That night, I barricaded the cellar door, hoping to keep whoever it was out. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle in the dark, made me jump. The tension in the air was unbearable. I kept hearing strange noises, scratching sounds like fingernails dragging across the floor, coming from the basement. But when I checked, there was nothing there. Around midnight, I heard something else, something far worse. The sound of glass shattering. I ran to the window and looked outside. I saw two figures running away from the house, disappearing into the night. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the figures were gone and there was no trace of them anywhere. The police searched the house, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. They suggested it was just someone trying to scare us, maybe even a prank. But I didn't believe that for a second. Whoever had been living in the storm room knew about the cellar door. They knew how to get in and out without being noticed. And the fact that they had been hiding in the house for so long, well, that thought haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching me. I never slept soundly in that house again. Every time I walked past that locked door in the basement, I felt the presence of something or someone waiting on the other side. I moved out a few months later, but I still can't shake the feeling that they never really left. Whoever it was who had been hiding in that storm room, they knew the house far better than I ever could, and I'm not sure they're gone yet. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear strange sounds from the basement. Scratching, tapping, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the storm room, and I'm not sure anyone will ever truly be able to leave it behind.